Hi, so we are here in a new edition of Late Night Anarchy to talk with Kat Murti about different issues about the libertarian movement, but first about libertarian feminism. So how you could describe libertarian feminism?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Camilo. Yeah, so I'm a libertarian feminist, and I think that there's a lot of confusion both in the libertarian and feminist communities about what that means. Libertarians, a lot of times, when they hear feminism, they think of this pro-statist type of feminism. And the same thing, a lot of feminists tend to view libertarianism as something that's only for rich white males, which I'd like to point out neither of us on screen are right now. And I think that that's wrong. I think that people are arguing against a type of straw man there. At their core, both libertarianism and feminism are really about equality and about the individual and about the individual right to live their life as they see fit without having to fit into a larger societal construct for what precisely they should be doing in their everyday decisions. And so as a libertarian feminist, I'm someone who believes in all genders being equal in the eyes of the law, having the same equal rights as each other, but not, I'm anti-state. I don't believe in using the state to equate people. I believe in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. And I think that there's a lot of space there, and I think that we're actually at a time where that line of thinking, I think, is going to become increasingly popular, and I think that that's good for us as a free society.
Yes, it sounds interesting because I think that even here in Latin America there is a criticism, especially to liberal feminism. Or I know that we don't say liberal in Latin America doesn't mean the same thing that in the United States, but with the more socially liberal feminism of Lina Dunham, and especially the late criticism, especially around sex workers, because the funny thing about the elections that were on Peru this year was that there was one candidate that was a sexual worker and was an advocate for sex workers' rights, and she was very interesting, and I think it was very interesting the fact that even some foreign media get to cover her, and it was very curious because Peruvian politics is not as known as Brazilian politics or Argentinian politics that sometimes get more coverage, I guess, in the region. But anyway, I think that there is a possibility of some connection. I know that in Bolivia, despite having a left-wing government, the feminists are highly critical of the government because they see him as very patriarchal in many ways, and actually a lot of feminists there identify themselves as anarchists and of different strengths. But it is interesting. I think, if I'm not wrong, Voltaire declared as early as the 19th century was very instrumental in
Emma Goldman.
Emma Goldman, and
yeah, she's definitely a left anarchist, but she was an anarchist. Yes. Definitely one of the great feminist leaders, I think. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack from what you were saying. There's are people like Lena Dunham feminists? Sure. Are people like Lena Dunham emblematic of what I think are the vast majority of feminists in the world? No, absolutely not. I think that there is definitely this idea that feminism is about using the state to promote the woman or something like that. And sometimes you get some really strange ideas of what that would be, whether it's, you mentioned sex workers. Of course, there are some feminists who are anti-sex work because they believe that it's entrapping the woman. Now, as a individualist feminist, as a libertarian feminist, first off, obviously not all sex workers are women. All people who hire sex workers are men. There is a lot of diversity there, but beyond that, fundamentally, sex work as long as it's not coercive, and I think you'll find most of the time it's actually not, is about a voluntary exchange. And when people pass these laws, supposedly to protect women, you know, anti-prostitution laws, all of sex trafficking laws, a lot of times what they're actually doing is putting women and other sex workers in a position of powerlessness. They're putting them in the types of positions that gets them hurt. And you see this, it's not just sex work. There's any number of other things. You know, I'm from, my family's from Chennai in South India. And in our last elections, one of the biggest issues that was being discussed, I mean, of course, there was the standard like corruption issues and everything else that everyone talks about, the gimmies, et cetera. But one of the big issues that was really making the rounds was alcohol prohibition, which is increasingly popular and is oftentimes billed as a feminist issue on the grounds that they say, you know, a lot of men will get just completely blackout drunk and come home and beat their wives. Therefore, it's a feminist issue to outlaw alcohol, when the actual, I think, true feminist position here is not this statist position. When, first off, women drink alcohol too. And of course, feminism isn't only about women, but you know, the issue is not the alcohol. The issue is the people who are coming and beating their wives. That's the actual thing that we should be addressing. And it's just so easy to turn around and find this one thing to blame and create this larger state. But in the end, your end goal is not changing anything. You're not making the genders more equal. You're not making women safer. All you're doing is creating an environment where all of a sudden something that could be a little bit safer in a better environment is now being pushed into a black market, and the same problems still keep happening. And now you've created an environment where poor women and women who are otherwise disenfranchised are less safe. They're not able to go and get help when there is a problem, and they're also constantly worried about being prosecuted by the state.
Yes, I think that there are a broad of issues that the libertarian feminists could handle, and another of the issues that especially Angela Keaton and Lucy Steigerwald are very passionate about is war, obviously, and the fact that especially there has been a strong feminist rhetoric about, especially on the Clinton side, trying to promote her as a feminist and trying to even
Right.
defend the Iraq War as some kind of feminist liberation.
Right.
And
That's exactly what I was
very
talking about.
strange because especially the point that Angela makes a lot of times is that especially women are vulnerable in the text, because in a lot of countries, especially in the Middle East, where women don't know how to drive, the men are more easily to have a car and escape from the tax, and it's more difficult, especially women who have children. And
you're home with children, right? Exactly. You're more of a target. And war obviously creates an incredibly unsafe environment for women and men and everyone else. I want to push back on the idea. So I think that in this past election, there was a whole lot of push for the idea that we should vote for Hillary Clinton because she was a woman. And I think that's actually a very anti-feminist ideal, because it reduces women to this idea that all we care about is identity politics, that all that we care about is that there's another woman in office. Of course, had Hillary Clinton been the first woman president, it would have been a glass ceiling, sure. But wouldn't it be so much better to have a woman in that role who's actually the best possible president? Now, I'm no Trump fan, but I certainly wasn't going to be voting for Hillary Clinton on the basis that she's a woman. And, you know, and when I start looking at her and I look at her record on particularly war, that was actually one of the big issues for me. But across other things, free speech, etc., I'm not going to be able to support her. And that doesn't make me less of a woman or less of a feminist. And the idea that because I am a woman, I have to vote that way is, I think, antithetical to what feminism is about.
Yes, I think it's still a very interesting. I think it could be a very, especially in the future. I guess that new generations are very complex and different in many ways.
Yeah.
There was an event that was hosted by the Charles Cox Institute, and and there was a young woman making a question, and she identifies herself as a libertarian Democrat, which is not that much common, but I guess that there are still some, and I think that it's going to be, especially ideologically, much more diverse than in the future.
Absolutely. I think, you know, even beyond feminism, of course, you did mention that there's a generational divide, and that's certainly the case. If you look at who older women, baby boomers and older, they tended to vote for Hillary Clinton on the grounds that she was a woman. But, you know, I'm a millennial. People my age, even Gen Xers, we've moved to the point where it was people no longer thought this is our one shot. They get the idea that, you know, even if Hillary Clinton is not the first woman president, there will be a first woman president. It'll probably happen in my lifetime, and we're not going to vote for someone simply on those grounds. And I think in the same way we're seeing a lot of ideological shifts. I think that's actually one of the big things that we've seen the past several months, and in fact years, where more and more Americans really are moving away from the two-party system. What those two parties stand for is shifting a lot. And yeah, so you see libertarians in both parties, in no parties. My colleagues, David Bose and David Kirby over at the Cato Institute did a study out in 2010 that found something like 14% of Americans they don't identify as libertarian, but they support policies that would identify them as libertarian. There's been all sorts of other studies as well that show even more people. We've had 2009 Gallup poll found 23% held libertarian views. A Zogby poll found 59% considered themselves both fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And 44 people in that same poll said that they were fiscally conservative and socially liberal and identified as libertarians. And you're seeing that change even more and more amongst younger generations, like millennials. If you look at some of the work Emily Akins has done, younger millennials are not only more likely to identify as independents or third-party voters, but you're also starting to see a greater divide in or rather not a greater divide, but it's starting to be more reflective of the American polity at large. You're seeing a more diverse group that are identifying as libertarians. Is very close to the actual demographics of our society in terms of folks coming from different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think that we're going to see that increasingly.
Yes, I think we will now move to the next subject. What's libertarianism in the US versus libertarianism overseas? And as someone that is from overseas, and more specifically from Peru, I mean, it's very complex to being a libertarian in Latin America, because complex in the ideological. I mean, the general people know, and Mises, and I would say mostly Friedman, but Mises and Hayek, but less, to a less extent. And for example, when someone like myself, I get to discover libertarianism via Carges, so I guess that I became libertarian in a very strange way, because it was a very radical vision of libertarianism, and it was something of a different path. But I have met some libertarians here, and some came more from the right. I guess I came from the left, but it is still a very complex issue, because there are some. I mean, there are some that try kind of political activity, but there is no libertarian. There are not necessarily libertarian parties here in Latin America. I mean, in Costa Rica, I knew that for a while there was some kind, although I guess it has go quite conservative with the time. And there are others that are very small that sometimes don't even participate in elections because they don't have enough signatures to inscribe it. So what some in Latin America do is mostly um, uh, join parties of the right, and some try to do some kind of activism there, but it's quite complex because I know a case of one economist that did his master's in public policy in Chicago. It was a very Friedmanite kind of reformer, and he was a very interesting guy. He was in favor of legalizing drugs, in favor of well, here the abortion is legal, so he was also pro-choice, and he was in many cases he matched the box of libertarians, despite he not being the kind of Rothbardian libertarian that probably some of the most radical libertarians want. But he was very interesting, and but the problem is that his party suspend his license, and I know that there are others that have happened some similar things in Latin America, and I don't know how you see things in libertarianism in the U.S. versus overseas. It's more easy, it's more complex because in one issue the part that is more in Latin America, there are no two-party systems, so
right,
in
yeah.
theory, a party could rise, but still libertarians haven't found a way.
So there's actually a couple things. First, I want to separate this idea of libertarianism and the Libertarian Party. Now, the Libertarian Party is a very interesting construct in the United States, and obviously they do promote, for the most part, libertarian views that the vast majority of libertarians might agree with. However, not all libertarians identify in the Libertarian Party, and I think one of the beauties, actually, of being a libertarian is that you can find issue areas that you can agree on with someone from basically any political background, almost. Other than the staunchest of authoritarians, we could probably find something to work together on. So you mentioned earlier having a friend who identifies as a libertarian and a Democrat. There's lots of friends we probably have who identify as libertarian and Republicans, or libertarian anarchists, or straight party libertarians. Maybe they're independents, and that's all just in the US. And if you look at the issues, you're never going to get one candidate who's really going to work well across the grounds. I mean, you can look at things like, look at Canada's Trudeau. He's certainly, I mean, he's a socialist, sure, but he's also promoted liberalizing certain policies in certain ways. For instance, his views on drug policy have been very positive. We can look at other people, like a lot of there are several libertarians on the right or free marketeers who might support someone like Pinochet, who, of course, you know, did horrible illiberal things,
Yes.
but also, yeah, maybe had some support for a certain set of policy ideals. And I think if you get wrapped up in this idea of having any one particular like libertarian savior that's going to take you to this free world, you're going to be harshly disappointed every time. You know, you really have to be willing to pick and choose and have alliances that are based more upon the policies and the outcomes rather than this sort of identity politics of we are wrapped up with this party or we are wrapped up with this movement and only this movement. And when this movement moves in this direction, we're going to go with them on this. I think it's better if we always hold ourselves strongly to the line of like, here, these are my values. I believe in freedom. I believe in free markets. I believe in free trade. I believe in immigration. I believe in freedom of exchange, free labor, those kinds of things. And in as much as you want to work with me on those particular issues, I will work with you. And on the issues where you are moving against that, perhaps I might be a little bit less vocally opposed to it as I might otherwise be if you weren't working with me on other issues, but I certainly would never support those issues, and I'm not going to promote those issues as such. And I think that when you look at it on the global level, there's a lot of room for that as well. As you mentioned, there's folks in leftist parties, there's folks in rightist parties around the world that are pushing, liberal policies at the same time as they're probably pushing a lot of illiberal policies. For a lot of Americans, it's difficult to comprehend that because, like you said, they really do get very sucked into this two-party system. But sometimes there's more opportunity. If we look at stuff, even like some of the recent rankings of world freedom indexes, some of the countries that end up coming up towards the top are countries that we don't even think about as being particularly libertarian. And I think that when you start looking at things on this piecemeal basis, you see a lot more opportunity for that. And, honestly, as anarchists, I think we're more primed than other people to work, to understand that it's not always just politics. A lot of the stuff is cultural change. We were talking about feminism earlier and how a lot of this stuff, these top-down statewide dictates, backfire if they were ever actually meant to bring about a true equality. They don't actually do so. What does change is changing the hearts and minds of people. And when you have folks out there who are working on an individual level, whether they're folks like, let's say, Pussy Riot, right? Pussy Riot, they don't identify as libertarians, but a lot of libertarians do value the role that they're doing in terms of speaking out against authoritarian control in Russia, some of Russia's crackdowns on the LGBT community, on what is so-called obscenity, on speaking out against the state. Right, so there are ways to work around that. And what makes Pussy Riot interesting is that they interact on this pop culture level. Like they have that appeal. It's not all about the political system for them. It's about creating change. And I think that we have a lot of opportunity to do that in parties around the world. And you'll always see, maybe there's not a libertarian party, but like, for instance, I mentioned my family comes from India. I spent a lot of time there growing up. There was a leader there, you always hear about it as, you hear about India as a very socialist nation, but at the end of it, when you start looking at this and you start looking at people, we have people like Rajaji of the Swatantra Party, that party is not around anymore, but some of the ideas are still there, that really did push some more stuff like free markets. And you have the folks with the CSS, the Center for Civil Society, and stuff like that all over the. I think that there are increasingly people who are getting these ideas, and when you look at stuff like, look at this discussion that we're having right now on the internet. It's available to folks everywhere in the world, and I think a lot of that's happening. And I think the internet is making these ideas more available, more popular. I think they're bringing together people who have these ideas about liberty, and they're giving them the tools they need to spread that. And I think that's what's important. So yeah, of course, engaging in the political system is valuable if you want to create change. Unfortunately, we do live in a society where politics rules a disturbing amount of our lives and what goes on in it. So yes, that is a huge part of change, but it's certainly not the only part. And I wouldn't feel as if the fact that there's not an official libertarian party in every country is a sign that there's not room for libertarian growth and that there's not people who are working towards liberty.
It's interesting, and I was going to ask you about what do you think about the Pirate Party in Iceland? Because as far as I know, there are some actual libertarians there. It's not necessarily that the party as a whole is libertarian, but as far as I know, some libertarians are there, and they are in favor of Bitcoin, and even a guy on the Cato Institute, some weeks later, there was an event, and he actually talked that they wanted to repeal some laws about fishing, if I am not wrong. So
right.
They are quite different than other projects that we see every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't speak too closely about the Pirate Party. They're not a party that I know of that well. I do know that they have supported some fairly libertarian views, some fairly socialistic views. across the board, but I think that's pretty emblematic of what we're talking about. And I think particularly for millennials moving forward, who really do have these sort of piecemeal ideas about policies at a time when people are increasingly moving away from parties, start to see parties picking up more and more of these liberty views, particularly as, you know, we live in a society where people expect to be able to do things like use Uber to exchange money, to exchange labor with other people. They expect to be able to use things like Airbnb. They expect to be able to download music online and to see whatever information, to have access to information. And I think those kinds of things are the sorts of things that parties like the Pirate Party pick up on, and that certainly is emblematic of some of the positive options for growth that we're seeing.
So the other question is, you being from India, your family being from India, how do you see libertarianism there? I think Shima Dalmia posted a link some time ago about an article about one, I don't remember, but it was one of the researchers at Cato that had done a research about the link between free markets and the caste system in India, how it breaks the molds of the caste system.
Yeah, certainly. Yes, that's actually an interesting caste system in India. You know, has been officially abolished since independence. It's legally, it's not necessarily supposed to be the case. I think that that's a bit questionable, especially if you start looking at some of the, they don't call it this, but I think for your audience, affirmative action that they do for certain groups. I mean, things are very much striated still to some extent. However, India has seen incredible economic liberalization over the past couple decades, and that, more than anything else, has really freed people up. All of a sudden, so many more people have the opportunity to work in so many more fields than they did previously. So, I mean, that's why I don't believe in capitalism, because I think capitalism itself is some sort of magical, amazing thing. I believe in capitalism because I think it's the freest system that we have out there. I think that if you believe in the freedom of the individual, capitalism embraces that, and that's what it monetizes. And what we've seen in India is a case where folks who've come from communities, some of the lowest caste or no caste individuals, have been able to make money, get their children educated, move up in socioeconomic ranks. And a lot of that is because of the market liberalization. Before, when the markets were more strictly controlled, they didn't have that opportunity. They were kind of trapped into a cycle of poverty. And therefore, I think it's really sad when we look at all of these examples. And this is a real world example. I mean, for me, this is, I've seen people just in the course of my own lifetime, I've seen how much India has changed, and it seems clear to me that a lot of that is because of the market liberalization. And it's sad to me that so many people in countries like the US turn around and they say, oh, the problem where capitalism is causing, you know, that's a serious concern, we need to shut that down. When, yeah, sure, perhaps there has been some there has been income inequality in the US. That might be growing, and if you look at the actual rate of quality of life in the US for all levels, it's grown. You know, people just in the past decade, what quality of life is for the people in the lowest socioeconomic classes is so much higher than it was a decade ago. And it's sad to me that people would turn around and sacrifice that because of some sort of adulation for this idea of over the idea of equality of opportunity, which is what capitalism really in its ideal state does provide.
Yes, I mean, the funny part is, for example, I will put an example that goes down to some kind of experience, but Bolivia actually, a lot of the growth in Bolivia actually is by the markets. Like, Walker,
yeah.
make
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think Bolivia is actually an interesting case because you saw, especially in the 90s, you saw a lot of liberals in the United States and Western countries that were kind of wringing their hands over the fact that they said that all of these Bolivians were leaving behind their traditional cultures and they were moving into these new jobs and things, and it was destroying the culture of Bolivia. But what that essentially comes down to is tourism. It's the fact that they want to be able to go in and take photos of people in their villages, doing things as they've always done, and they don't like the idea that these people now all of a sudden, a woman who, where previously her time and energy was best put into hand knitting, let's say one of those traditional blankets for hours a day, now it's so much easier for her to make instead of making all of those clothes, she can work, she can afford to buy herself several sets of ready-made clothes, she can feed her family better. And I think that you saw the same thing too from a lot of liberals as talks to help end the Cuban embargo and liberalize America's trade relationship with Cuba at the end of 2014. There was a lot of hand-wringing about how Cuba's culture would be destroyed by American capitalism because you're no longer going to see cars from the 1950s on the road. And I can understand why, from an aesthetic perspective, that might matter to people, but when you actually care about the quality of people's lives, do you want to live in a bubble trapped in the 1950s? If you want to, of course, you're welcome to, but the idea that you would use the state to force other people to because you think it's quaint and cute is just, it's sickening to me.
Yes, and I think Bolivia is quite a very interesting example, especially El Alto, which is a city that is near La Paz, because El Alto is almost completely indigenous. I think 90% of the population identify themselves as indigenous, and the city was basically built by them. It wasn't a project of it's recently that it has just went there and start to live there, and now is the biggest open market in Latin America. You could find anything from cars to weapons to literally everything, and it's quite a very interesting experience. So now going to the other topic, the issue and a question that probably a lot of libertarians will do is how is going to be libertarianism in the age of Trump, because I know you recently hosted the event in the Cato Institute about free speech, and it was interesting because I think that because of the narrative about the political correctness in the left, the right has have some kind of free pass.
Yeah, the patriotic correctness, it's the same idea.
Of their own. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I understand why there is a lot of hand-wringing, certainly. You know, this was particularly for a lot of people, this was a shocking election. They weren't expecting to see it go this way. Now, I can't honestly tell you that I think that Hillary Clinton would have been some sort of great free market, free enterprise, was going to be pushing this wonderful libertarian utopia. But certainly what frightens people about Trump, I think, is the sort of populist nativist movement that we're seeing on a global level as well, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, if we're seeing like the rise of populist nativist parties in particularly the former Soviet bloc, other countries around the world. That's terrifying, and that's something that we need to keep an eye on. And this talk that we've seen from these parties, from these candidates in the U.S. with Trump, with the push against the TPP from the Philippines with Duterte, and from pushing to stop trading with the United States, which was a short-lived plan that he stepped away from quite quickly. But I can see where that concern lies. This election, just in the United States, was between the two least popular main party candidates of all time. And what we saw, we didn't see much of there's a lot of talk about the popular vote, but so many people didn't vote. So many people voted for independent candidates. If you look over the course of the Libertarian Party's history, the average presidential candidate averaged 400,000 votes. That's it, 400,000 votes. If you look at this year, over 4 million votes. That's huge. That's a huge indicator of where the electorate is. Like I said, every year over year, you're getting more support for libertarian ideas, whether it's ending the drug war, whether it's some of the stuff we've seen here with gay marriage, LGBT rights, whether we've seen increased support for immigration. Granted, among certain communities, but I mean, there's still there is a lot to be hopeful for. I mean, even if we start looking at, a lot of people say, oh, but look at the campuses, young students now, they're all leftists, they're anti-capitalist, all the ideas are anti-capitalist, they're pushing socialism. But when you start digging into that, when you start asking them how to define capitalism, to define socialism, their ideas of socialism are not a market-controlled economy. They really do believe in economy where you can have stuff like you can take an Uber to your Airbnb, where you can sell people things from your Facebook Market page, where you can do these kinds of things. A lot of it, I think, has to do rhetoric that's used around it, with the language that we're using. And I think that there's a great opportunity for libertarians, particularly independent libertarians, non-aligned libertarians, libertarians who aren't as interested in playing party politics, but who are interested in actually making real policy wins for freedom. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to go out there, engage with people, and find where they're at, what issues they care about, and then meeting with them on that. And I think that makes me really hopeful. That we also need to talk about the fact that, there were a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. There were a lot of people who voted for Bernie Sanders, and we need to talk about why they did that. And I think a lot of the reaction that I've seen, unfortunately, has been turning around and saying, like, first off, right after the election, you got all those people who were saying, how did people vote for Trump? How did this happen? No one I know voted for Trump. Well, yes, but no one you knew voted for Trump, because you've been following this policy for a long time of if people are saying things you don't like on social media, you immediately block them, you unfollow them, that kind of thing. And of course, if you're going to use social media in that way, that's fine. But then you can't be surprised when this stuff arises. And there are a lot of people, and then some of the pushback talking about Trump voters, in terms of like making fun of them for being poor, for living in trailers, that kind of thing. I think there is this, when we talk about the economic divide in the United States, I don't think it's as much something about income inequality as it is this regional inequality, where there are all of these sections where the jobs are gone, and these jobs aren't gone because of immigration, which is the narrative that you hear often, that's unfortunately, I think, set up that way because it divides people and it's easy to push people into those camps. A lot of it's because of automation. The factory jobs, they're not coming back. People don't want the factory jobs to come back, but they're in a situation where they're poor, they don't have a job, they would have to pack up and leave a town that maybe, most Americans only live 50 miles from where they grew up. It's a big ask of people who live in places where the jobs no longer are to get up and move. And I think that if we want to build a freer society, if we're more interested in actual policy change than we are about virtue signaling about who we are and who we identify with, the opportunity to work with these folks to find market-oriented fixes for how they can improve their communities, for how we can work together, and to help message to folks both on the left and the right who are pushing these sort of anti-market ideas, finding ways that we can show them from the things that they already believe in a respectful, friendly, open manner, why it is actually that a free society would give them what they're looking for, would give them the dignity, would give them the respect, would give them the opportunities, the market opportunities want. And I think that that's a huge opportunity, and it's one that I'm really hoping that more libertarians really take advantage of in these next few years.
Yes, so what do you make of the statement that has been made in the last days that some liberals have tried to make a statement, especially on social media, that in the Trump administration it will be some kind of libertarian, liberal, or left-wing alliance, and I think it could go in various ways, because the other day even Ron Paul of all people was interviewing in RT, and when they asked about him about capitalism, he said that he's not interested in defending the war capitalism, so he says that he promotes free markets, and that's his thing, and it was very interesting that interview, and I think it's wide of a more broadly speaking in the Carhead style of trying to reach out to anyone who is more or less of a free marketeer, even if not necessarily a libertarian. Um, and on the other side, there is the project of the Niskanen Center that I have seen as a new think tank, and especially what Will Wilkinson is writing, that it tries to merge aspects of liberalism and libertarianism, and I think there are elements very interesting in that. The issue that Sweden or Norway, several of the Scandinavian states have, according to some studies, more economic freedom than the United States.
Right.
It's very interesting, and his conclusion was the fact that there is still exists some kind of social welfare, makes that the quote unquote neoliberal reforms have been accepted by the population, and the fact that in America the social safety net, because despite that it exists in certain ways, not as powerful like in Scandinavian countries, so has happened like with trade, I think would be the perfect example. And there is other even more radical trying to assess libertarianism and the left, that is the one of the left libertarians, the people of the C4SS. And I was talking with one guy over there, that it was very interesting. He's trying to make a review about a Marxist, a free market Marxist, or I know that sounds quite strange, but there are some kind of market socialists, and not necessarily are fans of China or and Cuba, no? but more of but they also don't have, at least the guy that was that he was reviewing his book wasn't against people seeking profit. So while he wasn't a libertarian of some sort, he was someone that was more sympathetic to market ideas than maybe ever. I think on these points, but on the other side, on the other hand, I guess that these can be, especially the liberal libertarian alliance, could be more of an opportunistic issue, because on the other hand, I know that Carr has his relationship with the left and of others in the left with the libertarian movement have been very long. The people of Counterpunch are very have a lot of respect for Rothbard, for example. But on the other hand, I guess that for example, issues as simple as with the homeless population, the fact that the liberals and progressives a lot of time try to suppress any kind of activist action around them. So it seems like the alliance is still
very
complex.
one-sided. People support the protest actions, etc., that support the views that they have, but then immediately turn around and have a million arguments for why it's wrong when it's promoting views that they don't have. And that's not just protests, that's across the board. Free speech, for instance, that's a big part of the issue that we see. Folks will have, they're fine with you saying one thing, but then you turn around and say something else. You kind of touched about this earlier, but when we have, there's a lot of pushback now against political correctness. by people who believe in something, which I think a lot of people are now, or increasing number of people are now hearteningly calling patriotic correctness. There's words and terms and phrases on both sides, opinions that are completely verboten, but there's no self-awareness about the fact that that's the same thing that's being applied to the other side. Which, yeah, absolutely. I think Tom Palmer, I heard him speaking several years ago, and I think I give him credit for this all the time when I'm talking because it's so true. He said, if one of the most important things to do when you're talking with someone is to assume that in almost all cases, most people in the world want to make a better world. They're not evil, terrible people who want to make a horrible world. They want to make a better world. And so if you find them where they are and understand why they think that the things that they're saying will make the world a better place, and you try to work at them from there, as opposed to assuming that they're evil and terrible, you have a lot more opportunity to actually change the discussion. And there's a few ideas here. There's the idea in political science that there's something called the Overton window. And the Overton window is essentially, let's say that we had a sliding scale here of all of the policy opportunities, from the most radical on the left to the most radical on the right. The Overton window is the window in which you have policies that would be considered generally acceptable by a moderate, essentially. Something that would be not too radical to discuss. It wouldn't flag you as a crazy radical. And I think that what we're really doing as libertarians, what we should be doing, is trying to move that Overton window slowly in the direction of more freedom. And so what that means is that when someone is saying something that's completely wrong, etc., in our view, you don't come out guns blazing and attack them. What you do is you try to understand where they're coming from, why they believe that, and what their end goal is, and you try to show them why most of the time your end goals are aligned. We talked about sex work earlier. We talked about the fact that there are, unfortunately, a group of a sect of feminists who want to make stronger laws against sex work, who want to push a lot of things like anti-sex trafficking, anti-porn laws, these kinds of things, even stuff that seems as simple as like the condom requirements that they tried to push in California recently. And they're doing all of this because, not because they're just evil illiberal people who want to make these women's and men's lives harder, but because they honestly believe that this is going to make these people's lives safer, better, etc. So when you look at that and you accept, okay, we both have the same end goal. We just have a very different idea of how to move there. And you kind of converse with them from that angle, where you're trying to find, okay, how can I do this? You're never going to be able to move them over in your direction in one conversation. But I think over time, if you treat them respectfully, if they know that the things that you're saying are fundamentally accurate, if you're not twisting the truth to fit your case, but if you're saying things that are actually true, and if you're willing to understand where they're coming from and hear their arguments, not only do your arguments become stronger, but they become more willing to hear them. And more importantly, all of the other people who aren't even voicing in onto your conversation, but are in the background listening, watching, seeing what's going on, they become much more willing to listen to where you're coming from as well. So I think that I think that it's very easy to fall into the trap of, getting into Twitter wars with people, getting into arguments with people, assuming that these are all horrible statists who just want us all to be unfree. But I don't think that it's a productive discussion that way. And I think that when you start looking at these left-right divides, you're going to kind of fall into the same things. Now, of course, we all need to have that moral background. Like, what is the one thing that you will not compromise on? For me, it's individual liberty. I don't want to compromise on individual liberty. Where that line is might differ. For instance, I support legalizing marijuana. I've supported all of the initiatives to legalize marijuana here in the U.S. And one of the criticisms I frequently get is, if you support the fact that they want to tax and regulate these things, you're not actually for free markets. And I say, yeah, that's great. I think that we need to have high taxes and onerous regulations on marijuana businesses? Absolutely not. I think first off, the same issues arise. I think as do in other markets. I think a lot of other issues arise. But when you're talking about, do I support taxes and regulations on a market, legal in quotes, of course, because it wouldn't be a true free market, but something like that, versus do I support SWAT coming in, guns blazing, knocking down people's doors and shooting their dogs? I think it's pretty clear to me which is the more libertarian option. A similar thing, people will have discussions about free trade treaties, and they'll push for, they'll say with things like the TPP, which I will admit I have not read the entire TPP, but I have discussed with folks like Dan Ikinson and stuff. I've read some of the work that they're doing where they have actually gone through, and they say that it's net liberalizing, and which is certainly encouraging to me. And people will say like, oh, but you don't support free trade if you support treaties, because these treaties obviously create constrictions on trade. But the problem is they're fighting for, it's the no true Scotsman problem. They're looking at it from the point of view of, in a vacuum where there is free trade, we're now putting these treaties. But that's not actually the way it works. In the real world, there are already a lot of constrictions, a lot of tariffs, etc. And if we're able to lift some of those, it's, I think, worth it to move forward with something that maybe has restrictions in it, but if on net it's freer than previously, it's worth pursuing. Now, with the TPP, for instance, you might have some concerns over the fact that they were attempting to push some of the more constrictive aspects of US IP law in other countries. I think that would be a place where you could have a serious issue with it. But if it's just, I don't like free trade treaties because they're the antithesis of free trade because there should be no laws governing them, then you have to look at it from a more realistic perspective and say, yes, but I also support free trade, and right now we have a system that is much less free trade than if we were to have this free trade treaty, which, yes, does not create an absolute free market, but does remove some of the barriers to free markets that we currently have. And I think if you start looking at things like that from the more pragmatic case, it can be difficult to do as ideologues, which I think we all are. we all have our views of a perfect society, but compromising with people on those kinds of things, knowing where you're not willing to compromise and understanding where people are coming from and why will get you a lot farther.
Yes. I guess that what I was trying to I guess there is some kind of echo, I don't know why, but anyway, the issue is that with what Hillary was saying in a WikiLeaks, I think it was that she was thinking in a hemispheric kind of trade without borders and migration without borders. It was kind of interesting. I think this Gary Howley, which used to write for Reason, make the tweet that I think probably resumed that secret Hillary is the best Hillary, and I think that she has a point, because I think that despite there were protests against TPP and so things like that, I think that if a kind of free trade agreement is also a kind of remove the need of a visa to go at least for tourist time, not for necessarily for immigration, but at least for tourist time, it will be, I think people will support it, because it is a very complex to get a US visa, especially here. I think it's a little more easy, but there are a lot of people. You have to wait 1 month to get an appointment. You have to then wait the big line, and it's quite
right.
And it's expensive. And
some of them are kind of ridiculous when it comes to visas. I had a cousin who finished a PhD in aeronautical engineering at Princeton, had a job waiting for him, and was told by the US government when he had tried to apply to convert his student visa into a work visa that he would have to leave the country and not return for 2 years before he could apply. That's the kind of thing where, like, who is this serving? What is the purpose of this?
Yes, it's quite strange, but I guess the issue it is a question of immigration. I think that I know that there are some, especially the political libertarians, question immigration, but I guess that when I was talking with Daniel McCarthy, I was saying that maybe it is true that maybe some libertarians should say that anyone who oppose immigration is a white supremacist or something like that, because here in Latin America there are people that are not white and that they have some worries about immigration. I mean, for example, there not has been a very welcome of
Yeah.
Asian immigrants from Haiti, and things like that. But on the other hand, I guess that the issue with immigration is that it has economic advantage, and that is something that Wilkinson has making the case for a while, that a lot of times people overlook that fact that is very important, especially conservatives that try to make the case against immigration on economic terms, but it isn't there.
I think, I mean, immigration is a hard issue for me too. You know, I'm a first generation American. I come from a family of immigrants, and I do tend to have somewhat of an emotional response to people who are just completely anti-immigrant. And so it can be difficult to turn around and say, like, oh, well, why do you think that just by issue of a mistake of birth, a surprise lucky draw, you should get to have more rights to this than someone else? Like, it is very easy to turn around and pull that racist card, but I think it's not productive. Of course, there are people who are legitimately racist, and that's their problem. But I think that if you also look at some of the concerns, people are frightened from an economic standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. And I think that rather than attacking them on the grounds of racism, a lot of times if we start making the case for, well, actually, immigrants help the economy, they don't hurt the economy. If we look at actual real number studies, immigrants are consumers. They're not just coming here and taking our welfare dollars or whatever it is that people are frightened of and taking your jobs. The number one issue, the number one reason that jobs are disappearing in sectors like manufacturing in this country is not immigration, it's automation. And that's not going away. But as long as people continue to see it as immigration, you're going to have this tension. And I think that if we attack it from that angle, if we try to show people the value of immigration in this country to them as individuals, if we show them the cultural contributions, if we can show them that kind of thing without making them feel attacked, fear is one of the most powerful motivators out there. And when people are lashing out because they're frightened, because they think that their way of life is disappearing, attacking them is only going to make them radicalize, make them pull back. I think that's part of the reason for the alt-right. You've always had these people who have had these ideas. They've been around for decades, and now all of a sudden, every think piece ever wants to talk about them. So all of a sudden, more and more people are hearing about them. These people, they understand sort of where I'm coming from. And I don't think that means that all of these people are just horrible, xenophobic racists. I think that they're legitimately scared, and that can be difficult to parse when you're looking at it from the perspective of people like you and me who are turning around and saying, like, no, when you're attacking immigrants, when you're attacking people who are from non-Western civilizations or not from Judeo-Christian cultures, you're attacking me. That same visceral reaction that we get to that, they get if we turn around and say, no, you're a racist, here you have to respond. I think it'll be, I think for a lot of these people, there is actually room to show them, like, no, actually, here's how this is improving. And I think addressing some of the core issues that are going on in their communities, trying to figure out what can happen when you live in a manufacturing town where the automation has taken away the jobs, where those jobs are not coming back. And as long as people are being told either you need to give up your way of life entirely, move away, which they're scared to do, Or you have someone who's coming in and giving them a populist nativist message of the immigrants are the cause of this. They're obviously going to choose that because that's the safer, better option. And we need to be going out there and giving them better options and showing them here's how your life can improve in your community. And no, it's not this us versus them divisiveness that's being fed to you. There's actual real world elements here, and there's things that we can do to help. And I think I think that'll go farther.
Yes, and for ending this, how do you see the project of trying to do private funds for refugees? The issue that someone think that also the case, especially with refugees, that no, they're gonna be a burden for the economy and things like that, and the issue that some like make that there should be a like in Canada where private citizens will sponsorship refugees.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Yes. So I personally support the idea of private citizens being able to sponsor refugees. I think that there's a lot of fear over refugees in this country, in Europe, and I think that fear is greatly overblown. I don't think that people need to be as frightened as they are, but I think that these so you have to accept. So the U.S. has only accepted something like 10,000 refugees from Syria, right? So this year, so it's not even that many that they've accepted, but you hear these stories and people are terrified, and I think a lot of that has to do with the way that they're being accepted on these mass government visas, where they come in and you hear people complaining like, oh, my small town all of a sudden has all these refugees. It's totally changing the culture. I think that the opportunity for individuals as individual acts of charity, which we as libertarians are big fans of, if they sponsor people to come and live in their homes, it's not only is it better for the refugees who are no longer stuck in refugee camps, refugee encampments, and I'm talking outside of the U.S. as well, in countries where, for instance, they're required to live in refugee apartment housing. They're not allowed to get a job. They're not allowed to even do things like make their own food or clean their own apartments because it's all banned for them for the first 2 years. Those kinds of things don't help. I think if you have a system where people are allowed to say, yes, I can take 2 people into my home, or I have room for 3 people, or I'm willing to take one single mother and her child, like whatever it is. Not only do you create these closer bonds with those individual refugees and people who are now sponsoring them, who they're living with, who give them kind of a guide, but you make it less frightening for the community, because it's the same way as if you go, let's say that you go to a party, and it's a party that you know no one at, right? So there's a difference between you being the guy off the street who just walked into this party and is now trying to meet people, or the person who comes with someone and you're so-and-so's cousin, or you're staying with so-and-so for the month and they brought you to the party. You'll notice you'll get a much warmer reception. And I think that it's a similar thing. I think that we should absolutely get more refugees. I think that we have an onus on us, particularly considering how much the U.S. has contributed, whether or not we want to own up to it, but contributed to the situation in Syria and in other war-torn countries in the world. I think we do have an onus to help the people who are trying to escape. But I think that the idea of the government coming in and allocating these people, central planning doesn't work, and central planning causes a lot of problems, both for the refugees and for the people. It creates resentment in communities, and the idea of individuals being able to sponsor people to join their communities, churches doing it, church groups, other sort of social circles. Not only are these refugees more likely to thrive here, but the people whose communities that they're joining really feel like these are new people joining their community, as opposed to, unfortunately, how a lot of people have seen it as almost like an insurgency that's coming in. So I'm extremely supportive.
Well, I think my opinion on this is more or less the same. Here in Peru, at least there isn't a project like this, but some there are some Syrian families that are helping their relatives and friends to come here. So I guess in some way they are trying to do this.
All right.
Well, with that, I think we could, and has been an interesting conversation with Kat Murti, which could be followed. And the direction is above in the in the description of the video to follow her on social media. So
Yes,
it's
thank you so
been,
much, Camilo. I really enjoyed this conversation. I told you before I've watched a few of episodes of the show, and it's always been really good. So it's an honor to be on, and I hope we'll continue this conversation. And for folks who are tuning in, if you find me on Twitter or Facebook as Kat Murti, I'd love to talk to you guys more about this.
well, bye.
Bye bye.